and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is World War II, the home front, specifically focusing on how the United States would mobilize for the war effort. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other, and, of course, their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So, mobilizing this war for World War II compared with World War I was not nearly as difficult because Pearl Harbor makes this a very patriotic, nationalistic effort. And of course, immediately after Pearl Harbor, we're going to see the passage of the War Powers Act that will give the president and the federal government the ability to allot materials and facilities as needed for defense purposes, with penalties for those who fail to comply. We will see this followed up in early 1942 with the creation of the War Production Board, who basically becomes in charge of allocating resources, of directing private businesses what to build, how much to build, and when to build. Again, this is built just like their World War I counterpart. And so the War Production Board, the WPB, is going to direct the conversion of industrial manufacturing into war production. For example, automakers like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, they've stopped making cars, they build tanks. Shirt factories now make mosquito netting. Kitchen appliance manufacturers like General Electric, GE, begin producing munitions. Civilian industry was converted into wartime production on a massive scale. Now, part of this wartime effort was also required the conservation on the part of everyday civilians, much like World War I. The slogan for World War II was once kind of, again, use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without, which encourages the public to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort. People were encouraged to collect scrap metal, to collect rubber, to grow their own food in so-called victory gardens in their backyard. There was tire and gasoline rationing common every day. Everybody was enlisted in the war efforts. Men, women, children going out and collecting things. I even had a colleague studying women in Southern prisons during the mid-20th century. And she found that these female prisoners were eager participants in the World War II wartime efforts as a way to validate, improve their citizenship and loyalty and patriotism, despite being in prison. Mexican Americans will eagerly join this effort, like the rest of Americans. Liberty bonds, they begin purchasing them in the thousands. Red Cross campaigns for blood drives, they participated as well in these. Specifically in the USO, Mexican American women began to form their own branches of the USO, specifically for the Mexicano and Latino servicemen. And so perhaps if you're a man who was barred from taking part in traditional activities due to discrimination, you would take part in the USO Mexican American version. Specifically, the women, they formed what became known as the Señoritas USO, a Mexican American female USO that provided recreational services for Latino servicemen. And of course, all of this mobilization is going to have a tremendous impact on the war effort itself. It's going to provide an enormous stimulus of government spending. In fact, total government expenditure during World War II was double the total of all previous federal spendings in wars in U.S. history. 10 times that of the World War I spending, 100 times more than the Civil War. The unemployment of the Depression was over. The new problem was not finding a job, but finding enough workers for a booming economy, a booming industry in the shipyards, aircraft factories, and gunpowder mills. And because wartime production was going on in most industries, some consumer goods became very scarce. Other goods ceased to be made as many industries began to convert into wartime manufacturing. Basic consumer goods, such as cars, washing machines, refrigerators, were scarce. Of course, when supply is low, cost skyrockets. So in 1942, Congress sought to remedy this by establishing the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, to set price ceilings, cap the prices, and freeze prices of consumer goods. As a result of this, and a result of the war effort, goods had to be allocated through rationing process. People would get a coupon book for basic goods like sugar, coffee, milk, gasoline, tires, meat. In 1942, the president himself is going to establish this program in order to take an unprecedented control of the economy. This is a new authority that even went so far as to control wage levels. Now, as you can imagine, this royally pissed off a lot of business owners and workers. Because workers are like, hey, this is our chance, right? We are at full employment almost. We are producing high demand. We should make more money. And yet the president, to not cause inflation, freezes not only the consumer good costs, but wages as well. And there were numerous threats of strikes in protest of these wage controls, but the government was in no mood to deal with it. But as a result of these strike threats, the government even went so far as to seize control of coal mines and the railroads for a short time in 1943. In 1944, the government would take over the Montgomery Ward Company, a department store that's now unfortunately out of business, because the company faced a strike of its 12,000 workers. As you see in the picture here, U.S. soldiers had to physically carry out the chairman of the company when he refused and defied the orders of the War Production Board. And of course, who do you think benefits from this? Like we saw during World War I, people on the margins of the economic system, women, African Americans, Mexicanos, and other racial minorities, began entering the industry at an unprecedented rate. Poverty was not eliminated during World War II, but the wartime jobs will provide so much better of life for people. Like World War I, as the men went to war, this caused labor shortages to the benefit of minority groups. This would see another great migration, but this time, westward migration. So a Western Great Migration. As African Americans and Mexican Americans begin to move and push out west to take part in the Pacific theater of the war, the wartime industry, building ships in the West Coast. More than 8 million people will move to states west of the Mississippi over the course of the 1940s. Small cities like Albuquerque and Phoenix, and larger cities like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego explode. For example, San Diego's population would increase 147%. It more than doubles during the war years of 41 to 45. These people were being drawn westward in search of jobs created by the war. Many of these people were migrating westward were African Americans and Mexican Americans. Again, so we saw during World War I in the North. This all provides new employment opportunities, especially for Mexican American and African Americans, but also created new problems. You see, while the Westward Great Migration put new people in new places, the federal government had to step in to ensure enough workers would be hired without discrimination preventing their employment. Excuse me. And so in 1941, the federal government would establish the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the FEPC, that was designed to protect and guard against racial discrimination in the defense industries. And so on June 25th, 1941, Roosevelt creates the FEPC by signing Executive Order 8802, stating that, quote, there shall be no discrimination in employment of workers in the defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, unquote. This was only passed, however, after the African American labor union leader A. Philip Randolph organized and threatened a march on Washington to protest the rampant discrimination in hiring practices. This was a godsend for African Americans and theoretically also would create the hiring of many Mexican Americans. And following the FEPC, Mexican American civil rights groups would press the government to promote occupational equality. But there's a problem here. The FEPC also created a struggle between contending ideas, especially here in Texas, which was a site between egalitarian and segregationist ideas, i.e. those Juan Crow laws. Because when the LULAC began to push for the enforcement of the FEPC for Mexican Americans in Texas, Texas fought back. Texas said, no. You're not hiring you. Discrimination, Juan Crow. And initially turned out LULAC fights back using similar tactics as African Americans, as African Americans were pushing for an anti-lynching bill. So LULAC begins to fight back very similar, linking the civil rights economic impact of hiring practices to that of the war effort to protect democracy. And again, if you take a good U.S. history course or a good African American history course, you talk a lot about how African Americans were using the fight for democracy abroad to try to secure civil rights at home, called the Double V campaign, victory abroad, victory at home. And they were one of the big things they were pushing for during the war itself was a bill that would ban lynching, make it illegal and enforce it. Remember, FDR was touting the United States as a great arsenal of democracy to stop fascism, but yet rampant discrimination is taking place at home. And so the LULAC begins to use a very similar tactic, linking civil rights to the war effort to try to force the government to force Texas to not discriminate against Mexican and Mexican Americans in wartime industries. They argued that discrimination was ultimately undermining American relations. LULAC connected the civil rights struggles to the broader foreign policy agenda. LULAC leaders used their personal connections to Mexican officials, appeals to the international policy of good neighborliness to bring the FEPC to the Southwest as one of several weapons in the arsenal to eliminate racialized hiring practices and pay practices in these key wartime industries. This caused even Mexico to bring diplomatic pressure against the United States to either end discrimination against Mexican descent personnel or face an embargo of Mexican laborers going to the United States from Mexico. But here's the thing. There was no willingness on state official and employers to confront the deep-seated culture of racism, the strong resistance by Anglo workers and unions, and the FEPC's lack of enforcement power, leading to very limited gains for Mexican American workers. In Texas, for example, workers submitted 115 national origins complaints to the Dallas office, representing more than a third of all the claims taken in. Ultimately, the FEPC is going to fail to resolve worker grievances at places like Shell Oil, Sinclair Oil, Humble Refinery Oil, all located in Houston, Texas, because Anglo-Unionists refused to accept that there was discrimination against Mexicans based on national origin. Again, the FEPC should have been a godsend for Mexican and Mexican Americans, but the gains were mainly theoretical. Because when groups like LULAC protested and took companies to court. The rulings that came back were that you, LULAC, for years now, have been arguing that Mexican and Mexican Americans are white and not of a different race, as a way to separate yourself from blacks, right? This has been done for years by LULAC, highlighting that whiteness quality, that they are not black, they are different from black, they should be treated as whites. And now LULAC is protesting, LULAC had protested the inclusion of Mexican as a separate racial category in the 1930 US Census. But now LULAC with the FEPC is arguing that they suddenly want to be treated as a separate racial category to achieve gains. Remember, the FEPC was to ban discrimination like national origin or race. But Mexicans were white. LULAC had been defending for years that Mexicans were not separate, that they were not black or brown or different. They were in fact white, and they deserved to be treated as such. So they were in a catch-22 situation here, wherein the FEPC technically did apply to Mexicanos. Because if they were white, they had no basis to claim job discrimination. They just weren't being hired by choice. That's not racial discrimination that the FEPC was concerned about. If, however, they were a different racial category, which for years LULAC had said, no, we're not, then that would apply. And so in ruling after ruling after ruling, court said no. The FEPC does not apply here. And as a result, most employers would channel and funnel Mexican Americans into low-level jobs, would pay them less money than other employees doing similar work, and would segregate them within job assignments. Now, nonetheless, please note, there was great progress made, and there would be some upward mobility through better employment, though just not on the same level comparably with Anglos. For example, the wartime demand on the production of American smelting and southern alkali had increased the number of jobs. But Mexicanos continued to work merely as day laborers, denied opportunities for advancement into high-skilled jobs. Anglo workers, on the other hand, progressed quickly up the ladder, receiving higher pay, even in instances when they performed the same jobs as Mexican Americans. In other certain industries, though, some workers were able to achieve common ground. These were often those with lighter complexions who were able to claim whiteness or pass for white. The result of this is that despite some modest gains among some certain groups of Mexicanos, usually lighter skinned, most Mexicanos still remain confined to the agricultural sphere, making overall gains limited. But the international protests of the FEPC did help bring the conversation regarding racism in Mexicanos to a higher level. A marked change from the Depression years where the conversation was just deport them. By widely publicizing even small acts of discrimination, like being denied service at a restaurant, LULAC and the Mexican government were able to get small progress and changes. LULAC also gave wide publicity to cases involving Mexicans in the military, partly to underscore the view that Mexicanos deserved equal treatment by virtue of their battlefield contributions we discussed in the last lecture. Denying soldiers service at restaurants suggested contempt of the highest order because neither military service nor personnel sacrifice seemed to be exempt from discrimination. In addition, one positive change was here in Texas, where the Texas state legislature did allow school districts to include Spanish language instruction in select grades beyond just the second year. This measure was inspired in part by the wartime spirit of inter-American cooperation. This legislation would expand Spanish language instruction and integrate Latin American cultural activities into the curriculum. So small, modest gains, even if they weren't complete or what they should have been. Outside the traditional Mexicano men, Mexicanas, Mexican American women also would take part in defense-related industries, filling in for absent spouses and sons gone overseas. They would work as drivers of heavy machinery, work as aircraft assembly line operatives, medical personnel, office workers, translators, worked in steel, railroad, and meat processing industry. Now, of course, promoting women to work in the wartime industry was part of the U.S. battle plan. The very famous, of course, Rosie the Riveter. But there was also Rosita la Remachadora. Again, a play off the term of Rosie the Riveter, used to identify women in general that work closely in defense-related industries. But so these Mexicanas were given the name Rositas, also known as riveting Rositas. These female riveters of aircraft industries who redefine traditional gender norms regarding what women could do for work. And as a result of it, when the war ends, while it's not a complete victory, it does force men to accept some new social roles for women. Even the more traditional viewing, Mexicano old school fathers and husbands would have to concede to women as new workers. And women were resilient in their efforts to redefine gender norms. Women were seen as crucial to sustaining the family during the war emergency. They were expected to contribute to the war effort and employment in defense-related industries. They also served, in addition to the wartime mainstream industry, they served in sewers, launderers, food canning industries, restaurant staff, domestic help, and of course, laboring in the fields. Some would receive good wages and became strong spenders and consumers themselves. It created a sense of contribution and empowerment. They became managers and supervisors, some. Some of them became the sole income earners at home. But on the other hand, many would face various forms of worker discrimination, again, being a double minority as a woman and as a Mexicana. They received the most unpleasant tasks at work. They were paid less than men, last hired, first fired. They would encounter occupational segregation. They found sexual advances and resistance from male coworkers, dealt with catcalls. But nonetheless, and again, I don't want to say this was all good or all bad. History is never all good or all bad. It's somewhere in the middle. And World War II does end the Depression. World War II will be a tremendous time of advancement, not just for Anglo-Americans, but for all ethno-racial groups, with a couple minor exceptions, as in the Japanese Americans. But it was not complete. African Americans will gain huge numbers, again, not complete, but huge numbers, rise up the ranks. Mexican Americans will rise up the ranks, economically speaking, though they still face a long road to go. Now, when we come back, though, there was one more big part to the wartime effort regarding, Mexicanos. And that, of course, is the Prosthetic Program. We'll talk about that next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.